Hey guys, we're back doing predictions for UFC Fight Night 119, Brunson versus Machida. Follow me on Twitter, my link is in the description, at MMA Breakdown 0, and I'll be back soon with my predictions for UFC 217, Bisping versus GSP. Alright, first fight on the Fight Pass prelim card at heavyweight, Colombo versus Marcelo Golm. I'm taking Golm here. Was only able to see a couple fights of his. This is his UFC debut, by the way, but looks like a heavy-handed striker. Really goes after his opponents from the get-go. And Colombo is just an old, fairly unathletic guy. Got ran over by Luis Enrique. Looked okay against Georgia Stanhope, but that's a pretty low-level UFC heavyweight, and even in that fight was only really having success in the front headlock position, landing some knees. So I think Golm, I think his pressure, his aggression is going to allow him to pretty much run over Colombo from the opening bell. So yeah, I like Golm by first round knockout, and I usually don't bet on debuting fighters or fights with debuting fighters, but I just think there's too much of a difference here in power and athleticism to not take Golm, so I am gonna bet on Golm and probably by knockout. So Golm by first round knockout. All right, a flyweight, Davison Figueiredo versus Jared Brooks. This could be a competitive fight. Both guys are strong grapplers. I think Brooks is the better wrestler, and Figueiredo, while he looked pretty dominant in his last fight against Marco Beltran, that was a guy who made a really tough cut to flyweight and a pretty unskilled guy to begin with, and still didn't finish him until the third round. So I think Brooks is the more physical, natural physical force at flyweight. He has the traditional wrestling game. The fight against Shelton wasn't all that impressive, but he hit the key takedowns when he needed to. Pretty effective at closing distance with his boxing. And yeah, in an extended wrestling grappling affair, I think Brooks just has the better control, the better wrestling, will be able to find top position more often than Figueiredo. But Figueiredo is the better BJJ grappler, could find his way to Brooks's back, do some tricky stuff on the ground. Not calling it a lock certainly for Brooks, but I do favor him here, so I'm going to take Brooks by decision. At lightweight, Hakron Diaz versus Jared Gordon. This, if this was Hakron Diaz of several years ago, I would favor him here probably. He used to be a really strong prospect earlier in his UFC career. Now not so much. I think he's kind of shop-worn at this point, really losing a few steps physically and athletically. So for that reason, I'm taking Jared Gordon, who I think just fights with a lot more confidence, a lot more authority in his striking and wrestling. His technique is not all that pretty, but just a really gritty fighter, always coming forward and always looking to press the action. I think that's enough to get past Hakron Diaz, who was dropped by Feely in that first round, almost TKO'd. Against Swanson, I thought he looked really timid, couldn't get any offense going. So yeah, Jared Gordon, while he fought a really overmatched opponent in his first fight, and Michel Quinones, really applied his wrestling, his pressure boxing, and was able to get that TKO win late in the fight. I think Gordon's confidence and assertiveness just breaks Hakron Diaz here. Yeah, so Gordon by decision. All right, on to the Fox Sports 2 prelim card at welterweight, Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos versus Max Griffin. I think this is probably one of the trickiest fights on the card. Zaleski dos Santos, I think, has the more diverse kickboxing game. Max Griffin, kind of your classic boxer with a lot of athletic gifts, a lot of speed and power in his hands. Absolutely destroyed Eric Montano in their fight. And before that, Colby Covington destroyed him with wrestling and ground and pound. Yeah, I don't know. If it stays on the feet, well, I think Zaleski dos Santos will be the more creative striker and could certainly make this kind of a weird, funky fight for Max Griffin with his kind of spinning attacks. You know, he throws a lot of spinning back fists and really explodes for a lot of, you know, funky kind of unorthodox attacks. I think Max Griffin, with his boxing, his hand speed, his power, and also that combined with dos Santos being hittable, and even Lyman Good, who's not a great fighter, he was able to connect pretty cleanly on dos Santos on occasion in their fight. I think that if it remains a striking affair, that Griffin, he would win that, even having to struggle a bit with dos Santos' kickboxing. But if dos Santos can get this on the ground, where he has some grappling ability, I think that you know, he stands a chance to out-grapple Griffin enough to get the win. If he's also able to have some success on the feet, could manage to steal a few rounds on the scorecards, get a decision. It's just hard to bet against such a gifted striker, such a gifted athlete like Max Griffin, you know, against a guy who hasn't been all that consistent. You know, even in the fights he's won lately, like in the Nakamura fight, the Lyman Good fight, you know, for stretches of both fights, you know, was losing, especially the Nakamura fight. Got taken down early, had his back taken, had to fight off a rear naked choke. So yeah, I think I'm going to go with Max Griffin, but I think it's a rather tough one to call, and I would stay away from this one for betting. All right, at middleweight, Antonio Carlos Jr. versus Jack Marshman. I think this is one of your safer picks on the entire card. I really like Carlos Jr. here to basically do what he does, and that's just drag Marshman down to the mat very aggressively and lock up a rear naked choke. I don't think Marshman could really do anything to stop that. Magnus Siedenblad was able to get him down in their fight, had some success beating on him from top position, and Marshman did make it back to his feet, ended up winning that fight by knockout, but since then just hasn't been able to repeat that same success. Dropped Thiago Santos in their fight, but that was about it. Ended up getting knocked out, I believe, by a spinning wheel kick. Yeah, and you know, Marshman against Ryan James, I thought he had you know, a total advantage going into that on the feet. Ended up being a super tough fight for him against a pretty really basic striker, and a guy who holds his chin up straight in the air. And Marshman did land some shots that were able to snap his head back, but for the most part, that was a really tough fight for him, and James really landed a lot, you know, did some damage to him. So I really think Marshman, his game has been kind of exposed, and you know, the area where he was supposed to be pretty dominant, we thought, on the feet, you know, not so much when he's having a really tough fight against Ryan James. But that's besides the point. I just, you know, we haven't seen Marshman have to face a really talented grappler, and this being in Brazil, I think Carlos Jr. is going to be, you know, get that bump from the crowd. So I don't think Marshman really has the ability to stop the takedown and stop from just getting his back taken and completely outclassed on the ground and submitted. So I would bet here on Carlos Jr., and I would bet on him by submission. Now, I won't call it a lock because Carlos Jr. is not a totally trustworthy guy. You know, he's a bit flaky at times. We all remember that crazy knockout loss, come from behind knockout win for Dan Kelly against Carlos Jr. You know, still one of the craziest things I've ever seen after starting so strong in that fight and getting him down, taking his back for the entire first round, not being able to submit him. And in the Marvin Vettori fight, his gas tank let up a little bit in that second round, and Vettori had a moment where he had him on the ground and was pounding away, coming or threatening a finish. So, you know, Marshman being a good striker, even though he's very hittable, having some power, he could clip Carlos Jr. I don't think that's impossible, but you know, us bettors, you have to be willing to take on some risk, right? So I think this is a risk worth taking, and I'm going to be placing a bet on Carlos Jr. by sub. Not, you know, not a huge bet, but a mid-sized bet. All right, at welterweight, Vicente Luque versus Nico Price. I think a lot of people are going to be fooled into thinking Price is going to kind of walk over Luque here after his admittedly very impressive knockout win against Alan Jouban. But if I think about Price's fights before that, even though he had nice finishes over both Brandon Thatch as well as Alex Morono, you know, the Morono fight, his lack of fundamental striking technique was really kind of getting exposed. He was getting staggered in that fight, taking shots. And the knockout, I don't want to call it a fluke knockout, but, you know, right at the final bell of the round, and Morono kind of dipped right into that uppercut. I don't know if that's something he can do against a really well-rounded, complete fighter like Luque, who is a skilled striker, who has big knockout power himself, and is a really good wrestler with some really dangerous submission ability. So, yeah, I have to go with the more complete fighter in Luque. He could lose. You know, he could lose against Price. What Price did to Jouban, you know, he used his length very well, and his timing, the way he found those openings and the moments he chose to explode, I thought was really impressive, and kind of an unusual timing and rhythm he employed in that fight, in combination with his length. So, you know, I won't put it past him to do something like that to Luque, but, you know, when you compare their entire games, Luque is just much more complete. I think he can out-wrestle Price, hold his own on the feet, if not win that outright. So, in a weird matchup like this, I have to go with the more complete fighter over the guy who's had some really impressive but kind of one-dimensional and kind of weird success. So I'm going with Luque by decision, but competitive enough that I wouldn't be comfortable betting on this one. All right, on to the FS1 main card at bantamweight, John Lineker versus Marlon Vera. Lineker by TKO. I'd be very surprised if Marlon Vera is able to submit Lineker here. And Marlon Vera has certainly been getting a lot better over his last few fights. I thought even in the Brad Pickett fight, while he was getting taken down, getting outboxed a bit in the pocket by Pickett, I thought he still looked really good on the feet. Has a really dynamic, unorthodox striking game, a lot of unusual attacks, and a sharp striker as well, and you know, ultimately knocked out Pickett, catching him with, what was it, a head kick? I thought he landed a spinning back fist or something like that. Maybe he did, leading up to the finish. Can't remember right now off the top of my head, but point is, Vera's really been improving over his last several fights, but Lineker should be the far superior striker here. Just from his technique, he has a much more fundamental boxing game than Vera. Vera's, like I said, a really dynamic fighter, but his striking game is really a lot of spinning attacks and kicks, a lot of kind of singular attacks, whereas Lineker is a really heavy-handed striker and has the more traditional boxing and should have a huge power advantage as well. Marlon Vera got TKO'd not all that long ago by Davy Grant. Lineker should be a much better version of Davy Grant. So yeah, I think Lineker pretty much runs over Vera here. I don't see him as the kind of fighter who's going to get caught up in a transition submission the way that Brian Kelleher did against Vera. He was going for a takedown when that happened, and I don't think Lineker's really going to spend any time on the ground because that's not how he fights. His fights have all been almost exclusively stand-up affairs, and Vera just doesn't have the same level of boxing as Lineker. So I think Lineker puts a lot of volume and pressure on Vera here. Vera's going to get outclassed. He is a good fighter, but I just don't see his style of catching unpredictable submissions and transition working against Lineker. So Lineker by, I would say, it could happen first round, but I'd say maybe second or third round TKO, and I think it is one worth placing a bet on. Maybe not by KO. Lineker has gone to decision against some guys like John Dodson, Rob Font, but certainly I think Lineker is worth a bet here. All right, at middleweight, Thiago Santos versus Jack Hermansson. I really love this fight. Two really clashing styles, and I think the perfect test for both guys. Hermansson, his mount has been something really special lately. What he was able to do to Brad Scott as well as Alex Nicholson. The guy's got a great mount, and he's got really kind of really great ground and pound that's become a lost art these days in the sport. But I don't know, we haven't seen more than that from him, at least in the UFC. And Santos, a very skilled Muay Thai striker, really diverse arsenal of strikes from his kicks to his punches. The I believe it was the spinning wheel kick that he caught Jack Marshman with, and is such a good striker that he's able to use it to really defend against takedowns. Did that to a T against Gerald Mearshart in his last fight. Elias Theodorou couldn't come close to taking this guy down. He would get the underhooks and land those knees to the body every time Theodorou attempted to take him down. And while Hermansson has come out, balls to the wall in his last couple of fights and just ran these guys down and was able to get his hands on them, drag them down, and mount them. I think that's too basic a style of getting people down to work against Thiago Santos' really lethal, really technical striking game. So I think Santos is able to keep this on the feet, defend any takedown attempts from Hermansson, and probably TKO him by the second or third round, because Hermansson's striking, while not bad, hasn't proven that he's able to win a fight with it against anyone meaningful. Beat Scott Askham, but even Cesar Ferreira, a guy who really struggles against aggressive fighters like Elias Theodorou and has one of the worst chins in the division. He landed hard shots on who are we talking about here? Jack Hermansson, and really found those openings all day long. Was able to hit the takedown and submit him. So I think Hermansson's just a little too incomplete, too one-dimensional. But Santos may have a weakness on the ground, you know. The way he lost to Eric Spicely still to this day doesn't really resonate with me, doesn't compute in my mind. Should have absolutely destroyed Eric Spicely, probably an even more one-dimensional fighter than Hermansson, but you know, on the ground was able to create enough scrambles that he was able to get Santos's back in transition. So if Hermansson is able to find his way into the mount, it could be ugly for Santos. But I think that Santos has really been coming into his own, really perfecting his style lately, and I think he's just too complete a fighter, too skilled on the feet for a guy who just kind of comes out pretty recklessly, looking to tie up with his opponents and drag him down. So I like Santos here. Not a lock, and even though it is probably a competitive matchup, you know, more so than some of the other fights on this card, I still think that Santos's style just wins out over Hermansson. So I think it is worth betting on. You know, not a lock, not you know, don't bet the house on it, but kind of like I said about the Carlos Jr. Marshman fight, I think it's one worth taking a risk on. So I like Santos by, I'm going to say, third round TKO here. All right, at lightweight, Francisco Trinaldo versus Jim Miller. Another really great matchup, should be a really entertaining fight. And kind of a tough one to call. Miller's really made some improvements in this latter stage of his career, even though he's not the same athlete I don't think he was you know, several years ago in his prime. I think he's really been sharpening up some of his striking tools, especially the leg kicks, which he really used very effectively against Dustin Poirier. Had him basically fighting on one leg by the end of that fight. And also came out pretty strong with leg kicks against Anthony Pettis, and even I think he hit a takedown or briefly took his back in that first round before, you know, eventually succumbing to Pettis's technique and wrestling. But yeah, Trinaldo certainly should have more firepower than Miller. He's a more aggressive striker, a wider array of striking techniques in his arsenal, a lot more forward pressure and just overall aggression. But Trinaldo kind of finds ways to give his opponents openings that they can capitalize on, like the Kevin Lee fight. Even though he was having some success in that fight, Lee was able to kind of withstand the storm. I think landed a head kick that put Trinaldo on skates and was able to get him down, submit him from there. And yeah, I don't know. You know, Miller's really struggled with the wrestling in the last couple of years. I mean, getting out wrestled by Diego Sanchez, not really a good thing. And even when he had Poirier fighting on one leg, still wasn't able to stop those key takedown attempts. Ended up losing him the fight, and then Pettis out wrestled him. And Trinaldo, he can hit a takedown. Man, this is a tough one. I was really feeling Miller initially. I thought that he could, you know, kind of find those openings, being the more composed, technical striker. You know, with his leg kicks and having a better jab, could kind of pick apart Trinaldo. And Miller is still, you know, an outstanding grappler, probably one of the best submission finishers at lightweight. Yeah, but Trinaldo just put so much pressure. I think I'm still going to go with Miller here. I think Trinaldo breaks in this fight, probably has some success early, but I think his gas tank is going to start to go in the later rounds, and then Miller can, I think, can probably take over from there. So yeah, I'm going to take Miller, being the craftier, more technical fighter here. But that's a really tough one, and one I would really stay away from for betting purposes. All right, at bantamweight, Pedro Munhoz versus Rob Font. Rob Font, I just think really highly of, really strong prospect, whereas Munhoz is a talented fighter but limited and kind of inconsistent. Just too hittable, I think, to get past Rob Font here. Rob Font, his striking game is solid. Haven't really seen fight-ending power from him since his... well, yeah, we did a couple fights ago against Matt Schnell. And also, you know, his first couple fights in the UFC, won by TKO. I could see him catching Munhoz here because Munhoz is just really hittable, really showed that in the Stasiak fight. But Munhoz has a guillotine, and Rob Font, you know, I think gets a little too overconfident sometimes in his offense. Was getting countered a little too much sometimes in the De Andrade fight. So I think that's a possibility that Munhoz could jump on a guillotine if Font gets a little overeager. But I think that overall, you know, Font's the safer pick here. I think he could knock out Munhoz or just outstrike him for a decision. You know, even in the Russell Doan fight, Munhoz ate some really hard shots in that initial exchange. Justin Scoggins was beating him before he submitted him, and Font, I just think, is a much more consistent fighter, and even if he gets a little overconfident, a more defensively aware fighter than those guys. So I'm going to take Font. I don't know if by decision or knockout. I wouldn't bet on him by knockout, certainly, but I think this is another one that I'm going to be betting on. I think it's you know, definitely worth the risk. Font's just a really bright, fast rising prospect, and Munhoz kind of a journeyman at this point, I think. All right, at welterweight, Demian Maia versus Colby Covington. I love Maia in this matchup. Yeah, I don't think he's ever had an opponent that will play so much into his style as Covington. And Covington, I really respect him. He's a great wrestler, maybe one of the best, if not the best, pure wrestlers in the entire sport. And really, you know, that's his style. He doesn't try to be a striker or anything. He's not. And he's really effective at consistently pursuing and completing takedowns. But doing that to Maia just doesn't seem likely at all. Honestly, I think it's kind of impossible that Covington is able to effectively wrestle Maia. You know, that's one of the things about Maia, is that he's not just a great grappler, but a really great wrestler, and a really unorthodox wrestler that you know, traditional American wrestlers, they can't defend against, because he does a lot of leg trips, a lot of pulling guard, stuff that isn't traditional wrestling, but is able to get the fight on the mat. So yeah, Covington, just too much of a static mat grappler, a guy who will hold position, can take your back, but you know, not enough of a scrambler, I think, to really even survive against Maia. I think Maia's going to submit him here. Just way too tricky and crafty and fluid on the ground for Covington. I think he's you know, going to be doing stuff that Covington can't even understand, and will take his back at some point and submit him. Covington, I think his smartest route to potential victory here would be to just strike with Maia. But Covington's not a dangerous striker. We haven't seen that from him. You know, his boxing's solid, it's serviceable, kind of basic, but you know, hasn't put anyone down with his striking. And I certainly don't think it's, you know, powerful or explosive enough the way that Woodley's striking was to create separation, you know, for 3 rounds against Maia. So if he chooses to do that, I think Maia, his wrestling's still good enough. His ability to walk guys down and shoot in on them, his ability to do that is strong enough that he shouldn't have any problem getting past Covington striking. So, yeah, I think it's pretty much a disastrous matchup for Covington that Maia should really have no problem overcoming. And I like Maia. I would pick him by submission. Wouldn't bet on him by submission, but certainly would bet on Maia. And if there's another fighter on the card that you feel pretty confident about, and probably what I'm going to do is try to identify one other fighter that I think is a clear favorite and parlay them with Maia, because I think Maia is my maybe Maia and Lineker. I think that's a pretty safe combination there to do a two-fighter parlay. But anyways, yeah, Maia is my pick. Feel really confident about him. All right, the main event at middleweight, Derek Brunson versus Lyoto Machida. This is an interesting matchup because Derek Brunson, I think, on the surface, should pretty much run over Machida, being the younger, more athletic guy, far more athletic at this point in both of their careers. Machida coming off of the layoff, having some really suffering some really brutal stoppages in his couple of fights before taking a 2-year break. But Lyoto Machida, the prime Lyoto Machida, has the perfect style, or had the perfect style, to beat a guy like Brunson. If Brunson, fights the way that he has in the past, which is to just recklessly blitz guys, come after them, leave his chin totally exposed, leave himself open to being countered. Machida, just one of the best counter strikers we've ever seen when he was in his prime. So if Brunson chooses to fight like that, I think Machida definitely has the skill to counter him, to capitalize on that, pretty much put him out. Anderson Silva, even at his age and his physical condition, still managed to steal a decision against Brunson, even though he didn't deserve to win it. Was still able to find enough openings, connect enough to convince the judges that he won that fight. I think Brunson has learned his lesson, though. I really think he did after that Whitaker fight. When he fought Dan Kelly, who didn't have anywhere near the ability to do what Whitaker did to Brunson, still fought him a lot more cautiously. Really didn't have that crazy blitz in that fight. Picked his shots pretty carefully, and when he did choose to open up, put Kelly down with, I think, maybe the first shot he really committed to. And I think if he fights like that, it'll be a much safer fight for him against Machida. And if he extends this fight, draws it into the later rounds, rounds 3 and on, I think the Machida, just with the layoff, having suffered a lot of damage in those in that Rockhold and Romero fight before his layoff, I think that now he may just be too shop worn, and with the layoff and his age, he just won't be in good enough shape to keep up in those later rounds. So I really like Brunson if he can do that, if he can fight smart. The wrestling, the power in his hands. I think he can kind of just work over Machida here, put in kind of a blue-collar performance. But if he goes after him the way he did against Whitaker, Alvey, Juan Carnero, those guys, is really leaving the door open for something pretty tragic to happen here. So I do like Brunson. I think I would pick him by maybe 3rd, 4th round TKO. But there is an opening there for Machida, and this is one that I would not recommend betting on. Even, like I mentioned with some other fights here, like Font, Munhoz, Junior Marshman, there might be some risk in those matchups, but still worth betting on. This one I wouldn't be comfortable betting on unless you do what I do and bet whatever really whatever a small insignificant amount of money is for you, if you try to parlay 4 or 5 fights to really get a big payout for a small bet, and you bet that really small amount of money, if you threw Brunson in a parlay like that, I would say that's the only case where I would think it would be worth betting on. But just a single bet, I still think that Machida has enough skill, and Brunson has the style to where Machida could really capitalize on his style. So yeah, Brunson's my pick, but those are my predictions, and let's just recap the bets that I intend to be making for this card. Alright, so first one is Marcelo Golm over Colombo. I mean, Golm's still a newcomer, but just the couple of fights of his that I was able to see, I think he just has such a power and athletic advantage over Colombo, and youth advantage, that Colombo's just going to get run over. So I would go with Golm. Probably go with him by knockout. You know, I wouldn't... You guys are probably tired of me, you know, saying don't bet the house, but you know, you can take my analysis as you wish and bet your money the way you want to. But I think Golm over Colombo, maybe he submits him, so maybe just inside the distance is the safer option. But from what I've seen, Golm is a heavy-handed striker and really looks to put people out with his hands. So I'm going with Golm by finish. And I think maybe under 1.5 rounds, that could also be a good option there. Junior over Marshman by submission, that's one I really like. Lineker over Vera, not by TKO. I wouldn't be willing to go that far with it, but Lineker over Vera, definitely one I like. Santos over Hermanson, not 100% confident in it. Not the way I am in Lineker or Maia, but I think another one worth taking advantage of. Font over Munhoz, I like that too. And Maia over Covington, I really like that one big. Some fights that I would be willing to throw in a parlay. You know, what I do is just kind of throw $5 and try to pick 5 or 6 fighters. You don't want to pick too many, because then, you know, then you're really making it really hard for your parlay to work out. It's tough to pick 6 winners, but yeah, I try to do a 5-fighter parlay every card, just throw $5 on it, and you know, there I'm okay with betting on a fighter that I wouldn't be confident enough to bet on as a single bet, but some fights that I would be comfortable enough to throw in a parlay like that. Probably Jared Gordon, Vicente Luque, and probably just those 2 guys, other than the guys I said I would bet on singularly. Doing one more scan of the card here. Yeah, I think that's about it. You know, Trinaldo Miller, that one's too competitive, I think, to bet on. Yeah, wouldn't do the Dos Santos Max Griffin either, but yeah, I think I would go with Gordon and Vicente Luque possibly. Alright guys, but that's it. Thank you for watching. Again, follow me on Twitter. My link is in the description at MMA Breakdown 0. And you can expect my predictions for UFC 217, Bisping versus GSP out within the next week. You know, in the week leading up to the fight. Alright guys, thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.